On the morning of August 12, 2021, airport security at Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport in San Juan, Puerto Rico, flagged a passenger for unusual behavior. His hands trembled as he handed over his passport, his shirt still slightly damp from sweat. The officers had no idea who he was until his name flashed in their system. Daniela Harris, formerly known as Daniel Harris, was not just any traveler. He was a fugitive. 8 hours earlier, staff at a secluded luxury villa in Rincon had made a horrifying discovery: a bloody crime scene and the lifeless body of Robert Jones, Daniela's newlywed husband. The murder was so brutal that investigators initially believed it was a crime of rage, not premeditation. But when authorities traced Daniela's financial transactions, flight booking, and disturbing search history, the case took a darker turn. What really happened between the couple in that isolated paradise? And why did their honeymoon, meant to be a celebration of love, end in bloodshed? Stay with us as we uncover the disturbing truth behind the bloody honeymoon, the wife no one wanted to be. For most of his childhood, Daniel Harris lived under the shadow of expectations. Born in 1989 in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was the eldest son of Pastor Jonathan Harris, a respected figure in his local church. His family's life revolved around faith, weekly services, scripture studies, and the constant pressure to be a model Christian. His mother, Margaret Harris, was just as devout, though softer in her approach. She had a heart condition, manageable but delicate. From the outside, the Harris family seemed picture perfect. But behind closed doors, Daniel wrestled with something he didn't understand. By the time he entered college in 2007, he had started questioning everything: the rigid beliefs, the traditional values, and most of all, his own identity. College changed everything. At Duke University, Daniel encountered people who lived freely, without the constant guilt his upbringing had ingrained in him. His classmates introduced him to conversations he had never dared entertain, and for the first time, he was exposed to relationships that challenged his beliefs. Slowly, he realized something undeniable. He was gay. He fought it at first. He prayed. He fasted. He attended Christian counseling sessions, desperate to fix himself. But the more he resisted, the stronger the truth became. When he finally accepted it, there was no turning back. By 2010, Daniel came out to his family. His mother broke down instantly. She saw it as a failure, a test of faith she had somehow lost. Her health declined rapidly, though she never blamed him aloud. Instead, she prayed harder, fasting more, hoping for a miracle. Daniel's father, Pastor Harris, reacted differently. He didn't yell. He didn't disown him. Instead, he sat in silence, just watching his son as if trying to recognize him. Then, without another word, he got up and walked out of the room. From that moment on, nothing was the same. Despite their disappointment, his parents never stopped talking to him. But their relationship became strained. His father's church suffered backlash. Some members left, claiming a man of God should not allow such sin in his home. Others stood by him, insisting that his faith should not be judged by his son's choices. But Margaret never recovered. She overthought everything, spending nights awake in prayer. Then, one morning in 2011, she never woke up. The official cause of death was a lethal overdose of her medication, but Daniel knew the truth. She had been consumed by grief. Even after her death, Daniel refused to suppress who he was. If anything, it made him bolder. He moved out, distanced himself from his father, and embraced the life he had always wanted. But deep down, the guilt never left him. His father, despite everything, never cut him off. He continued to call, send messages, and remind him of his love, even if it was tinged with disappointment. Daniel responded less and less, though he never blocked him completely. The only person he never turned away was his younger sister, Lily, who had special needs. She never judged him. She just loved him. For years, Daniel built a life outside of his family's expectations. He pursued a degree in computer science, eventually becoming a freelance software engineer. He worked remotely, earning a solid income, and by 2018, he had over $100,000 saved, plus crypto investments that were steadily growing. Then, in 2019, he met Robert Jones. It was supposed to be a simple night out at the movies, a solo trip to see Moonlight, a film that mirrored much of his own journey. But that night, fate intervened. Robert was everything Daniel wasn't: fearless, rebellious, and utterly free. He had no past to haunt him, no family to judge him. Raised in the foster system, he had never known stability, never answered to anyone. He moved through life on his own terms, and Daniel was drawn to him instantly. They bonded over shared experiences, over their struggles to fit into a world that often rejected them. But while Daniel had spent his life fighting against control, Robert had spent his life defying it. At first, their connection felt electric. It was intense, passionate, almost intoxicating. But beneath Robert's charm, there was something unsettling, something Daniel chose to ignore, something that 2 years later would turn their honeymoon into a crime scene. When Daniel Harris met Robert Jones in the dimly lit theater, it felt like a moment of fate. He hadn't been looking for love, yet there it was, bold, unashamed, and undeniable. Robert had a presence that demanded attention, a confidence that was effortless, almost intoxicating. They started talking after the movie, an easy conversation that stretched into hours. Robert had a way of making Daniel feel like the world outside didn't exist. They left the theater together and spent the rest of the night wandering the streets, learning each other's histories. Robert, as it turned out, had no family to speak of, no parents, no siblings, no one waiting for him anywhere. He had grown up bouncing between foster homes, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. He had learned early that the only person he could rely on was himself. Daniel, in contrast, had roots he had spent years trying to sever. But where Daniel carried the weight of his past like a burden, Robert had none. Within weeks, Robert was practically living in Daniel's apartment. They moved as one, late-night drives, spontaneous trips, whispered secrets under dimly lit street lamps. But there were red flags, small ones easy to ignore. Robert had a temper, though it never seemed directed at Daniel. He had a problem with authority, never holding a job for long. He got into fights easily, always blaming the other person. He was charming but unpredictable, a man who lived by his own rules and broke them when he wanted. Daniel overlooked it all. He was in love, or at least he believed he was. Robert had introduced Daniel to new spaces, new people, a new way of living. Daniel, always the careful one, found himself taking risks he never would have considered before. They partied harder, traveled more, made reckless financial decisions, though Daniel always found a way to stabilize them. It was Robert's idea to open a joint bank account, a sign of trust, of commitment. Daniel hesitated but agreed, believing in their future together. After all, trust was the foundation of love. Or so he thought. Daniel was making more money than ever. As a freelance software engineer, his skills were in demand, and with the rise of cryptocurrency, his investments were growing fast. Robert, however, was still struggling to hold a steady job. He worked in construction, jumping from one company to the next. He knew his trade well, but he didn't take orders well. He refused structure. Money was never a major issue. Daniel made enough for both of them. But looking back, there were warning signs he should have noticed. Robert had started making financial decisions without consulting him, small ones at first, then larger ones. He would withdraw cash without mentioning it, shift money between accounts, make purchases Daniel hadn't approved. Daniel brushed it off. Love required compromise. By mid-2021, talk of marriage became serious. Daniel proposed in June, a private moment between just the two of them. Robert said yes without hesitation. It seemed like a natural step, but something about it felt too easy, too fast. When Daniel told his father about the engagement, there was silence on the other end of the call. Then, a simple response. "Are you sure?" Daniel didn't answer. His father didn't attend the wedding, but his sister did. It was the only approval Daniel needed. What should have been the beginning of forever was instead the countdown to disaster, and it all started on the third day of their honeymoon. The honeymoon had started like a dream. The villa in Rincon, Puerto Rico, was secluded, sitting along a quiet stretch of beach, with nothing but the sound of crashing waves and rustling palm trees. It was exactly what Daniel had imagined. Private, peaceful, and a celebration of the life he had chosen. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. They indulged in the luxuries of their villa, spent time exploring the nearby town, and lost themselves in the feeling of being newlyweds. The isolation felt romantic, as if they had escaped the world entirely. But on the third day, everything changed. It started subtly, shifts in Robert's demeanor that were hard to define at first. He spoke differently, carried himself with a quiet authority that hadn't been there before. He began asserting control in ways Daniel hadn't expected, making decisions without consulting him. By midday, Daniel noticed something else. Robert had taken full control of their finances. The shared accounts, the cryptocurrency investments, even the savings Daniel had built over the years, all now locked behind passwords he could no longer access. When Daniel questioned it, Robert dismissed his concerns as unnecessary, implying that it was his responsibility as the husband to manage such things. It was the first time Daniel had heard their relationship framed in such a way. Up until now, they had always been equals. But in Robert's mind, it seemed, things had changed. The power dynamics began to shift rapidly. The same man who had once encouraged Daniel's independence now treated him like someone to be controlled. Small things became points of contention. Robert criticized the way Daniel spoke, corrected his decisions, and exerted authority over things that had never been issues before. The tension that had started that morning escalated into something more dangerous by nightfall. Robert's behavior grew more unpredictable. His temper surfaced more frequently, though never with outright aggression, at least not yet. It was more in the way he moved, the way he looked at Daniel, the way his presence filled the space in a way that made Daniel feel smaller. Then came the realization that Daniel was now trapped. The villa, once a paradise, had become an isolated prison. With no nearby neighbors and no immediate access to transportation, leaving was not as simple as just walking away. The roads leading back to the main town were unfamiliar, and without control of his finances, Daniel had no way to book a flight home. By the end of the third day, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about control. This was about power. And Robert had no intention of giving it up. The honeymoon was no longer a celebration. It was the beginning of something much darker. The morning of the fourth day in Rincon began with an eerie stillness. The air inside the villa felt heavier, the once inviting space now suffocating. Daniel had barely slept. His mind raced through the events of the previous day, the financial control, the shift in Robert's behavior, the unspoken dominance that had started to settle between them. He was no longer sure if he was on a honeymoon or if he had walked into something far more dangerous. Robert acted as if nothing had changed. He moved through the villa with quiet confidence, setting the day's plans without so much as a discussion. There was no room for Daniel's input anymore. When he hesitated or resisted, Robert's reactions were subtle but chilling. A lingering look, a tightening jaw, an unspoken warning. By the afternoon, the power struggle that had begun the day before took on a new form. Robert had always had a short temper, but Daniel had never seen it directed at him. That changed when he refused to go along with one of Robert's demands. The response was immediate. Not violence, not yet. but a dangerous silence. The tension didn't dissipate. It grew. Daniel spent the rest of the day measuring his words, calculating his movements. Every interaction became a test. How far could he push before Robert snapped? By nightfall, the cracks widened. A minor disagreement over something insignificant became something much larger. Robert's anger surfaced in a way Daniel had never seen before. He slammed his glass down onto the table, shattering it on impact. The sudden outburst sent a clear message. The illusion of safety had shattered along with it. Daniel knew then that he had to leave. But escape wasn't easy. The villa was isolated, and Robert had taken the rental car's keys. Daniel's phone, which had been left on the counter earlier that day, was now missing. When he searched for it, Robert merely watched him, saying nothing. That was when it became undeniably clear. Robert was in full control. The realization sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He had never feared Robert before, but now that fear had settled in his bones. He had seen men like this before, men who slowly strip away autonomy, not with sudden violence, but with calculated control. That night, as Robert slept beside him, Daniel stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. The room was dark, the only sound the rhythmic crashing of waves outside. He thought about his father, his sister, the life he had built, and how, in a matter of days, he had lost control of it all. But there was one thing Robert didn't know. Daniel wasn't powerless. He had spent years adapting, surviving, learning how to navigate situations where he felt outnumbered. Robert had underestimated him. He had mistaken silence for submission. What Robert didn't realize was that Daniel had already begun planning his escape. He just had to survive long enough to make it happen. By the 6th day, Daniel's body had adapted to the constant state of fear. His movements were careful, his words measured. He had learned that resistance was met with consequences, though none had been physical, until now. The first time it happened, it wasn't an obvious act of violence. Robert didn't punch him, didn't throw him against the wall. Instead, it was something almost calculated. A firm grip on Daniel's wrist, fingers pressing hard enough to leave marks. A forceful shove that sent him stumbling back when he refused to comply with something trivial. A silent warning. The progression was terrifying in its subtlety. A raised voice one moment, a tightening grip the next. By the end of the day, Daniel knew with certainty Robert was testing his limits. It happened again that night. A sudden outburst, an accusation that Daniel was trying to manipulate him, that he wasn't being the partner Robert expected. When Daniel tried to step away, Robert grabbed him harder this time, pushing him against the bedroom wall. Not enough to cause serious harm, but enough to make a point. He was in charge. Daniel didn't react. Reacting meant escalation. He stayed quiet, his pulse hammering as Robert stared him down. Seconds passed before Robert finally stepped away, muttering something under his breath before leaving the room. For the first time, Daniel genuinely feared that Robert might kill him. But something else had changed, too. The fear was still there, but now, so was something else. Survival instinct. Lying awake that night, Daniel stopped thinking about escaping. He had tried that once, and Robert had been waiting for it. He had no phone, no money, no way to get off the island without Robert knowing. That left only one option. If Robert wasn't going to let him leave, Daniel would have to make sure Robert never left either. The shift had begun. The 8th day began like all the others, except this time Daniel knew it would be the last. Robert woke late, his body sluggish from the previous night's drinking. He moved around the villa without caution, stretching, checking his phone, logging into their accounts as if nothing was wrong, as if he hadn't spent the last week turning a honeymoon into a prison. Daniel watched him closely, every movement, every habit. He had spent days learning Robert's weaknesses, understanding his patterns. The drinking had made him slower. The arrogance had made him blind. By midday, the tension had grown thick. Robert had begun correcting Daniel again, criticizing the way he moved, the way he spoke. He had grown comfortable in his control, certain that Daniel was too broken to resist. But Daniel wasn't broken. By evening, the plan was in place. The villa's kitchen knives were too obvious. A struggle with those would leave too much of a mess. He needed something that would incapacitate Robert quickly. The wine bottle was the first choice. It was heavy, blunt, and within reach. As the night settled in, Robert poured himself another drink. The glass sat loosely in his hand as he leaned back on the patio chair, his attention drifting. He had no reason to be cautious. Daniel stood behind him. The weight of the bottle felt firm in his grasp. His heart pounded. Then, impact. The first blow sent Robert forward, his glass slipping from his fingers and shattering against the floor. He groaned, disoriented, his body lurching as he tried to push himself up. The second blow came harder, a sickening crunch. Robert collapsed onto the deck. Daniel didn't stop. The fear, the humiliation, the rage, it all came out in the brutal onslaught of strikes. The wooden patio turned red, the sound of the waves swallowed by the chaos of what was happening. By the time Daniel stopped, Robert was unrecognizable. For the first time in days, Daniel felt free. But freedom wouldn't last. His hands trembled as he stared at the mess in front of him. The realization hit all at once. This wasn't over. He needed to leave. Now moving quickly, Daniel grabbed his packed bag, the one he had been readying for days. His passport. His remaining cash. The blood on his hands smeared against the fabric, but he barely noticed. He had 8 hours before anyone discovered the body. If he moved fast enough, he could be on a plane before authorities even arrived. But he underestimated how quickly the world would close in on him. By the time he reached the airport, they were already waiting. The drive to Luis Muñoz Marin International Airport was a blur. Daniel's hands trembled on the steering wheel, his mind racing through the steps ahead. Check-in. Security. Board the plane. Disappear. He had 8 hours. That was what he told himself. Enough time. But panic made time feel shorter. He parked the rental car in long-term parking, wiping the door handle before stepping out. His clothes were dark, simple, meant to blend in, but nothing could disguise the fact that his pulse was hammering. His movements were too deliberate. Inside, the airport was busy. The crowd should have made it easy to disappear, but instead, Daniel felt exposed. Every glance in his direction made him feel like someone knew, like someone had already called the police. The first problem came at check-in. The airline employee paused longer than usual while looking at his passport. Daniel forced himself to stay calm, pretending to check his phone, as if he were just another tourist heading home. The second problem came at security. As he placed his bag onto the conveyor belt, he caught sight of 2 uniformed officers standing near the exit. His stomach dropped. The moment he stepped through the body scanner, one of them started moving toward him. Daniel knew then he wasn't getting on that plane. Daniel didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The next few moments happened in a haze. His hands were pulled behind his back, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking into place. His rights were being read, but the words barely registered. He only heard one thing. They had found Robert's body. The escape was over. As he was led through the airport, the weight of what had happened finally settled in. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. He had survived Robert, but now he would have to survive the consequences. Then came the trial of Daniel Harris. The prosecution painted a cold and calculated picture, a man who had planned the murder of his husband days in advance. They presented evidence of the brutality of the attack, the force used, and the failed escape attempt. But the defense had a different story. They argued that Daniel had suffered emotional, financial, and physical abuse at the hands of Robert Jones, that his actions weren't premeditated, but a response to a week of entrapment and escalating violence. They called psychologists to testify about battered spouse syndrome, explaining how Daniel's mental state had deteriorated under the manipulation and control Robert had inflicted upon him. None of it mattered. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. On March 8, 2022, Daniel Harris was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with a chance of parole after 18. The judge acknowledged the abuse he had suffered but stated clearly, murder was not justified. Daniel's father, Pastor Jonathan Harris, never spoke publicly about the case. But he was in the courtroom the day the sentence was read. His face was unreadable. Weeks later, Daniel received his first letter in prison. It was from his father. The envelope contained 2 things, a handwritten note and a small, worn Bible. The note was brief. I may not have understood your choices, but you are still my son. This is where you find redemption. The Bible had marked passages, verses underlined in faded ink. Daniel ran his fingers over the pages but never opened it. Not yet. His sister, Lily, was the only one who visited him, twice a year without fail. She never asked him why. She never looked at him differently. She only smiled, held his hands through the thick glass, and told him about her life outside. For Daniel, that was enough. As the years stretched ahead, his story became just another case file in the system, another headline in the true crime archives. But for those who followed the case, one question remained unanswered. If Daniel hadn't killed Robert that night, would he have survived at all? Some stories have no true heroes, only victims of circumstance. Make sure to subscribe to this channel for more gripping cases.